Have you ever paused to wonder what winter meant before we tamed it? Before switches, insulation, or glowing screens stood guard against the cold? Picture a world where frost did not merely nip at the edges of life. It shaped every choice, every shared blanket, every careful breath from November to April. Tonight, we drift into that world, into villages where people listened to the wind like scripture, where warmth was something earned, and where winter was not an enemy, but an old, demanding companion. Together, we'll trace the small wisdoms that once made survival possible, the silent rituals, the humble resilience, and how so much of it has quietly slipped from memory. If this kind of slow journey brings you peace, feel free to like and subscribe to Epic Boring History, only if it truly helps you rest. And I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the night. There's something comforting about knowing who else is wandering through history beside us. So, soften the lights if you can. Maybe let a quiet fan hum in the background. Let your body settle. And as the modern warmth around you holds steady, allow your thoughts to step backward into a time when winter wasn't avoided, but understood in ways we've nearly forgotten. You wake in darkness, though you cannot say what hour it might be. The air inside your dwelling holds a bite that penetrates through the wool blanket you share with your husband and 2 children, all of you pressed together on a straw mattress that crackles faintly with each small movement. Your breath forms small clouds in the blackness above you. The embers in the central hearth have dimmed to almost nothing during the night, glowing like distant orange stars in the earthen floor's shallow pit. Outside, you hear nothing. That particular nothing that means fresh snow has fallen, muffling the world. It is early December, perhaps mid-December. You've lost the precise count of days since the harvest ended and the rhythm of winter began. You know you must rise soon before the embers die completely. Once the fire goes cold, relighting it becomes a task that devours precious time and the tinder you've been rationing since October. But for just a moment more, you lie still. The warmth of bodies pressed together is the only true heat you'll know until tonight, and you're reluctant to surrender it. Your daughter shifts beside you, her small frame tucked against your side. She's 7 now, old enough to help with the day's work, though her hands still blister easily from the cold. Your son, older by 3 years, sleeps near your feet. His breathing is steady, undisturbed by the hunger that has become the constant companion of these winter months. Your husband's arm lies heavy across your shoulder. He left 2 days ago for labor service at the manor house, one of the many obligations that come with working the Lord's land. You are alone now with the children and the animals. The cow, 2 goats, and 3 chickens occupy the far end of the single room, separated from your sleeping area by a woven hurdle that doesn't quite reach the low ceiling. The smell of animal bodies, animal breath, and animal waste mingles with the scent of old smoke and damp thatch. You no longer notice it. This smell has been the smell of home since you were born into a dwelling much like this one. Slowly, carefully, you extract yourself from beneath the blanket. The cold hits your skin like a physical blow, and you move quickly now, your bare feet finding the packed earth floor. The floor is frozen solid. In summer, it's merely hard-packed dirt, dusty and uneven. In winter, it becomes stone, radiating cold upward through the soles of your feet until your toes ache. You move toward the hearth, feeling your way through the darkness. Your hands know every inch of this space. The position of the rough-hewn table, the corner where the water bucket sits, the hemp sacks containing what remains of your grain. The embers glow faintly as you kneel beside them. You reach for the kindling you prepared last night, thin strips of bark and dry grass carefully bundled and placed within arm's reach. Your fingers fumble slightly, the cold makes them stiff, clumsy, and you must work carefully to coax the fire back to life without wasting fuel. A breath, gentle and steady, directed at the embers. They brighten slightly, and you add the smallest piece of kindling, then another, watching as tiny flames begin to lick at the dry material. The fire is your morning miracle, the daily proof that you can hold darkness and cold at bay for another day. But it's also your greatest anxiety. You're burning through your carefully gathered wood faster than you'd hoped. The winter came early this year. The first hard freeze arrived while you were still gleaning the edges of the harvested fields, and now you're 3 weeks deeper into the cold season than your stores were meant to cover. As the fire builds, you add larger pieces of wood, each one placed with consideration. Too much at once, and you waste it. Too little, and the fire dies again, forcing you to restart the entire process. Gradually, a dim orange light fills the room. The thatch ceiling appears above you, blackened from years of smoke, sagging in places where moisture has weakened the straw. You can see your children now, still huddled together beneath the blanket. Their faces are pale in the firelight, thin from the rationing that has already begun despite winter's early arrival. The animals stir behind their barrier. The cow lows softly, a sound you recognize as the morning request for fodder. You move to the corner where your water bucket sits. The surface is frozen solid, a thin sheet of ice that you must break with the handle of your knife. The sound, a sharp crack, causes your daughter to stir. She opens her eyes, sees the fire burning, and knows without being told that the day has begun. Outside, the darkness is beginning to thin. It's not sunrise yet, but the quality of the blackness has shifted, becoming grey at the edges. You wrap your cloak around your shoulders, a heavy woolen thing that scratches against your neck but holds some warmth. Every garment you own is wool or linen, layered and patched and repatched until the original fabric is barely visible. The door is simple, made of rough planks held together with wooden pegs. It fits poorly in its frame, and you've stuffed the gaps with old rags and straw to keep out the worst of the drafts. You push it open, and the cold floods in like water. Your breath catches in your throat, and you step quickly outside, pulling the door closed behind you. The world is white. Snow covers everything, the narrow path that leads to the well, the bare hedgerows that separate your land from your neighbours, the distant line of trees where you gather your firewood. The sky above is grey, heavy with the promise of more snow. There's no wind this morning, which is a mercy. Wind makes the cold impossible to bear. Your feet find the path by memory rather than sight. The snow is perhaps 6 inches deep, new and soft, and your shoes, more like leather bags wrapped around your feet, sink through with each step. The well is at the centre of the village, shared by perhaps 15 families. It's a simple thing, just a circle of stones rising from the ground with a wooden bucket on a rope. When you arrive, you find the surface frozen. You take the rope and lower the bucket through the hole in the ice, feeling the resistance, hearing the crack as it breaks through. The water you pull up is so cold it makes your teeth ache to look at it. But this is the water you'll use for everything today: cooking, washing, drinking. You carry the bucket back toward your house, moving carefully on the slippery path. The weight pulls at your shoulders, and you must stop twice to rest and shift your grip. By the time you return, your daughter has risen and is adding wood to the fire. She knows not to use too much, knows the arithmetic of survival that every child learns by the time they can walk. Your son still sleeps. You let him rest a little longer. There's no urgent work for him today, and sleep is a mercy in winter, a way to pass hours without feeling hunger. You set the bucket near the fire, hoping the water will lose its worst chill before you must use it. Then you turn to the day's first meal. Breakfast is oat porridge, the same as yesterday and the day before. You measure the oats carefully, counting out portions that will keep you alive without depleting your stores too quickly. The calculation is constant, running through your mind like a prayer. If you use this much per day, you should reach March. But what if winter lasts longer? What if the stores are less than you thought? What if someone falls ill and cannot eat the coarse grain? You add water to the pot, a clay vessel that's been in your family for longer than you can remember, its surface blackened from years of sitting in flames. The pot goes directly onto the fire, balanced on 2 stones. While the water heats, you tend to the animals. The cow must be milked, though she gives less each day as winter deepens and her own fodder dwindles. You sit beside her on a low stool, your forehead pressed against her warm flank, your fingers working the familiar rhythm. The milk streams into a wooden pail, thin and slightly blue-tinged, but still milk, still sustenance. The goats receive a handful of dried grass each, not enough to satisfy them, but enough to keep them alive. They push against your legs, seeking more, their breath warm against your cold hands. The chickens are the easiest to care for. They roost in a small wooden box, generating their own warmth, and they require only a scatter of grain and vegetable scraps to survive. You collect 2 eggs this morning, a small victory. In deep winter, the hens often stop laying altogether, and each egg becomes precious. Back inside, the porridge is beginning to bubble. You stir it with a wooden spoon worn smooth from generations of use, watching as it thickens. Your daughter stands beside you, holding a clay bowl. She's learned to wait patiently, to never ask for more than is offered, to accept hunger as a natural state of being. You portion the porridge into 3 bowls. Each serving is small, just enough to take the edge off emptiness without truly satisfying. There's a piece of bread from 3 days ago, now hard as wood. You place it near the fire to soften slightly, then break it into pieces to share. The meal is eaten in silence. There's weak ale to drink. You brewed it yourself in autumn, using the last of the barley, but it's thin and sour, more water than anything else. When your son wakes, you give him his portion. He eats quickly, without comment, then asks if he can check the snares he set yesterday at the edge of the woods. You nod. Fresh meat would be a miracle, though the snares rarely catch anything in winter. The morning passes in the rhythm of small tasks. You card wool while your daughter spins, both of you working near the fire to keep your fingers supple enough for the detailed work. The wool is from your own sheep, or rather, from the sheep you tend for the Lord. You're allowed to keep a portion of the shearing, and you've been spinning it into yarn for months. This yarn will eventually become a new tunic for your son, who has outgrown his current one. But the spinning is slow work, and the weaving slower still, and you wonder if you'll finish before spring arrives. Your daughter's hands move steadily, pulling and twisting the fibre. She learned this skill by watching you, the same way you learned it from your mother. Outside, the day remains grey. The sun must have risen at some point, but you cannot see it through the heavy clouds. By midday, though you mark the time by feeling rather than any clock, you prepare the second meal. It's vegetable stew this time, made from dried peas that have been soaking since yesterday, and a few wizened turnips from your root cellar. The root cellar is a pit dug beneath the floor in the corner of the room, covered with boards and earth. It's where you store the turnips, onions, and parsnips that must last until the spring planting. Each time you descend into it, crouching in the narrow space, feeling in the darkness for the remaining vegetables, you count what's left and recalculate the weeks remaining. The stew cooks slowly, filling the house with a thin, savoury smell. You add a pinch of salt from the small clay pot where you keep this precious commodity, and a few dried herbs you gathered and hung last summer. Your son returns empty-handed from checking the snares. He's cold to his core, his lips faintly blue, and you sit him near the fire until colour returns to his face. You give him the stew and watch him eat. He's at the age where he needs more food than you can provide, his body growing despite the scarcity. The afternoon is devoted to repairs. Your husband left you a list of tasks: mending the thatch where it's pulling away from the roof, securing a loose board in the door, checking the hurdle that separates you from the animals. You work slowly, conserving energy, stopping frequently to warm your hands at the fire. Your daughter helps where she can, holding boards steady while you wrap them with cord, passing you tools. The work is never ending. As soon as one thing is fixed, another breaks. The house itself is old, older than you, perhaps older than your parents, and it requires constant attention to remain even minimally functional. By late afternoon, the light is already fading. Winter days are short this far north, and darkness comes early, stretching the evening into long, cold hours. You light a rush candle, your only one, saved for special need, and use its feeble light to do a final check of your stores. The grain sacks feel lighter than they should, and you make a mental note to be even more careful with portions. Evening meal is the remainder of the midday stew, reheated and thinned with more water. There's no bread left, and you eat with wooden spoons, scraping the bowls clean. After eating, you sit close to the fire with your children. This is the quiet time, the time when stories might be told if energy permitted, but tonight you're all too tired for words. Your daughter leans against you, her head on your shoulder. Your son pokes at the fire with a stick, watching sparks rise toward the smoke hole in the ceiling. The animals shift and settle behind their barrier. Their breathing is loud in the silence, and their presence is a comfort, both for the slight warmth they provide and for the simple fact of other living things nearby. You think about your husband, sleeping tonight in the manor house's draughty stable, performing whatever labor the steward has assigned. You hope he's warm enough that he's been given sufficient food for the work. The fire begins to die down. You add one more piece of wood, the last you'll use tonight, and watch as it catches and burns. Soon it will be time to sleep. You'll bank the coals carefully, covering them with ash to slow their burning, and hope they'll survive until morning. Your daughter is already drowsy, her eyes closing despite her effort to stay awake. Your son yawns, showing teeth that are starting to decay. A common affliction, one you share. You make your way to the straw mattress, the children following. The bedding is cold now, all the warmth from last night long dissipated. You lie down together, arranging the blanket to cover all of you, tucking edges beneath your bodies to trap any heat. Your daughter curls against your chest, and your son presses against your back. The cold seeps up from the floor. It finds every gap in the blanket, every exposed bit of skin, and settles there like a living thing. But slowly, very slowly, the combined heat of three bodies begins to build. A small pocket of warmth forms beneath the blanket, and you feel your muscles start to relax. Tomorrow will be much like today. You'll wake in darkness, coax the fire back to life, feed the animals, portion out the food, work at small tasks, and return to bed. This rhythm will continue through December, through January, through February, through March, if the winter holds that long. Each day a small battle, each night a small victory. You close your eyes and listen to your children's breathing as it deepens and slows. The cow shifts behind the hurdle, and somewhere outside, an owl calls, a lonely sound in the winter night. The cold presses down from above and rises up from below. But here, in this small pocket of warmth, with your children's breath against your skin and the faint glow of banked embers nearby, you feel something that might be peace. You know things your modern descendants have forgotten. You know how to read the color of smoke to judge the quality of wood. You know which herbs, dried and saved, will ease a winter cough. You know how to bank a fire so it lasts the night. You know the sound of good ice versus bad ice on the well. You know how to walk in snow without exhausting yourself. You know which hunger is dangerous and which is merely uncomfortable. You know how to make 3 eggs feed 5 people. You know how to render every scrap of fat, every bone, every peel useful. You know that survival isn't about heroic acts, but about small, careful choices repeated daily. You know that warmth is relative, that cold is a spectrum, that the human body can endure far more than seems possible. You know that winter isn't an enemy to defeat, but a season to coexist with, to respect, to understand. You don't fight the cold, you accommodate it, finding ways to live within its constraints. This knowledge is woven into your bones. It was taught to you, not through words, but through experience, through watching, through doing, through the simple necessity of survival. And tonight, as you drift towards sleep in your freezing house with your hungry children and your meager stores, you carry this knowledge forward into another day, another winter, another turn of the seasons that have shaped your family for generations beyond counting. The darkness deepens, the cold intensifies, but you are still here, still breathing, still surviving, and that in the end is the only victory that matters. Let us turn now to one life, one woman, and let her quiet story unfold in the manner of winter itself, slowly, without drama, revealing itself through accumulated detail rather than sudden revelation. Her name is Agnes, and she lives in a village called Fenton, a place of perhaps 20 households scattered across a shallow valley in the north of England. Agnes is 34 years old this winter, though she doesn't know her exact age or date of birth. She marks time by harvests, by the births and deaths that punctuate the years, by the slow accumulation of experience that bends her back and silvers her hair. She was born in this same village in a house much like the one she inhabits now. Her mother died bringing a stillborn son into the world when Agnes was 12, and her father followed 5 winters later, taken by a fever that swept through the village and claimed 7 souls. Agnes remembers her childhood in fragments, the taste of her mother's barley cakes, the sound of her father singing while he worked in the fields, the feeling of sun on her face during harvest. But mostly, she remembers cold and hunger, the twin constants that defined her early years as they define her life now. She can recall specific moments with startling clarity. The way frost patterns formed on the inside of their cottage walls, creating landscapes of ice that melted when touched. The sound of her mother's voice calling her in from the fields at dusk, a sound that still echoes in her memory 2 decades after it fell silent. She remembers the weight of her younger brother in her arms, the baby who died before his first summer, his small body growing cold despite all her attempts to warm him. That loss taught her early that love offers no protection against the world's indifference. She was married at 15 to Thomas, a man 10 years her senior, the son of a freeman who worked land adjacent to her father's strips. The marriage was arranged by her uncle, her father being 3 years dead, and Agnes met Thomas only twice before the wedding. The first meeting lasted perhaps 10 minutes, both of them standing awkwardly in her uncle's yard while the men discussed terms. Thomas had seemed tall to her then, his hands rough and capable, his face weathered beyond his years. The second meeting was at the church door, where they spoke the words that bound them before God and community. She had worn her mother's best kirtle, altered to fit her smaller frame, and Thomas had given her a worn copper ring that caught the light. She bore her first child at 16, a daughter who lived 3 days before a fever took her. The grief was sharp and immediate, but Agnes had little time to dwell in it. There was work to be done, fields to tend, obligations to fulfill. She remembers the weight of that tiny body, the way her daughter's eyes never quite focused, the desperate prayers she whispered while the baby's breathing grew more labored. She remembers Thomas digging the small grave in the churchyard, his shoulders shaking though he made no sound. Her second child, a son she named William, arrived 2 years later and survived. His first cry filled the cottage with sound, and Agnes wept not from pain, but from relief, so overwhelming it felt like drowning. Then came Margaret, her daughter, now 7 years old, and learning the tasks that will define her own life. Margaret has her grandmother's eyes, Agnes thinks, the same clear grey that seems to see more than it should. Between Margaret and now there were 2 more pregnancies that ended before term, blood and pain that left no children to bury, no names to remember. Agnes marks these losses silently, counts them among the many griefs that women carry without speaking. Thomas is a good husband in the ways that matter. He doesn't beat her, he shares the burden of work, and he treats the children with a rough kindness that passes for affection. But he's also bound by the same constraints that bind Agnes, by obligation, by scarcity, by the endless wheel of seasons. She has seen him age visibly over their 19 years together, his back curving, his hands developing the twisted fingers that come from too much cold and too much labor. This winter, Thomas is away more than usual. The manor lord has called for additional labor service, and Thomas spends 3 days of every week at the manor house, repairing stone walls, clearing drainage ditches, hauling wood for the lord's enormous fires. The lord is preparing for guests, Thomas explained before he left. Important visitors from the south who must be impressed with the manor's prosperity. So the peasants labour, while the lord's halls are made ready for feasting. Agnes is left to manage the holding, their half-virgate of land, the animals they tend, the house they inhabit. The responsibility sits heavy on her shoulders, a weight she carries without complaint, because complaint achieves nothing. A half-virgate is roughly 15 acres, though the actual amount varies depending on the quality of soil and the lord's generosity. Their strips are scattered across 3 fields, some fertile, some less so, all of them demanding constant attention even in winter. She wakes each morning before dawn, as we saw in that earlier house, in that earlier life. Her routine is much the same: fire, water, animals, children, endless small tasks that fill the hours. The fire must be coaxed from the banked coals, fed carefully with precious fuel until it catches properly. The water must be fetched from the communal well, a journey of 50 paces each way, carrying the heavy bucket that leaves her shoulders aching. But Agnes's winter is complicated by her son's absence. William, now 16, was sent 3 weeks ago to work as a labourer for a wealthier peasant 2 villages distant, a temporary arrangement meant to bring in a little extra grain before the deep winter sets in. The decision to send him was difficult but necessary. The wealthier peasant needed strong backs for his expanded holdings, and he offered payment in grain, precious grain that could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Agnes misses him with a constant, aching pressure in her chest. She worries about whether he's warm enough, whether he's being fed adequately, whether the work is too hard for his still developing frame. At night, she imagines him sleeping in some stranger's barn, cold and lonely, wondering if his mother thinks of him. She wonders if he has enough blankets, if the food is sufficient, if the other workers treat him fairly. She worries too about Margaret, who has developed a cough that won't quite leave. It's not severe, not yet, but Agnes knows how quickly winter illnesses can turn dangerous. She has seen children sicken and die in the space of days, their small bodies unable to fight off the fevers and lung sicknesses that thrive in winter's cold. Every cough from Margaret's throat sends fear through Agnes's body. Each night she lies awake, listening to her daughter's breathing, counting the breaths, noting any change in the pattern, the sound. She makes warm infusions of dried horehound and honey, precious honey, saved for just such need, and has Margaret drink them despite the child's protests at the bitter taste. The horehound was gathered last summer from the roadside, dried carefully in bunches hanging from the rafters. The honey came from the manor's beekeeper, traded for 3 days of Agnes's labour during harvest. Agnes's days are filled with spinning. She spins constantly, her hands moving in the familiar rhythm even when her mind wanders. The wool she works is poor quality. The sheep gave thin fleeces last year due to summer drought, but she spins it anyway because thread is currency, thread is survival. Each skein represents future possibilities, cloth to sell, cloth to trade, cloth to keep her family covered and warm. She's spinning now, sitting near the fire on a low stool, the distaff tucked under her arm, the spindle dangling and turning. The motion is hypnotic, soothing, and her mind drifts as her hands work. The distaff is made of smooth wood, worn by decades of use. It belonged to her mother before her, and perhaps to her grandmother before that. The spindle is weighted with a clay whirl that Thomas made for her years ago, its uneven shape evidence of his limited skill as a potter. She thinks about her mother, dead these 22 years. She wonders what advice her mother might give about Margaret's cough, about the dwindling stores, about Thomas's absence. Her mother had seemed old to Agnes when she died, though she could not have been more than 35. She had borne 7 children, buried 4, and died trying to bring another into the world. She thinks about the year she was 10, a winter so harsh that the village lost 5 children to cold and hunger. She remembers huddling with her younger brother in their single bed, both of them whimpering from the pain in their empty stomachs. That winter, ice formed inside the water bucket and didn't melt for weeks. The priest found an old woman frozen in her bed, her body rigid, her eyes still open. She thinks about her daughter's future. Will Margaret marry? Will she bear children who survive? Will her life be easier than Agnes's own, or will it be more of the same endless struggle? Agnes hopes for better, but expects the same. The world does not change for people like them. It only repeats itself in endless cycles of hardship. These thoughts come and go like the snow outside, falling, accumulating, eventually melting away without changing the fundamental landscape. Agnes doesn't dwell on them. Dwelling serves no purpose. She has learned over the years that some thoughts must be acknowledged and then released, like birds you hold briefly before opening your hands. To cling to them is to invite madness. Instead, she focuses on the immediate. The thread growing on her spindle, each twist of her fingers adding to its length, each completed skein bringing a small sense of accomplishment. The fire that needs feeding, the careful balance between warmth and the need to preserve fuel for the long months ahead. The chickens that need checking, their bodies searched for eggs that come less frequently in winter's cold. The bread dough she's set to rise near the hearth, covered with a damp cloth to keep the crust from forming. The anticipation of bread baking is itself a kind of nourishment, something to look forward to in the grey hours of afternoon. Bread making is an art Agnes has perfected over 20 years. She knows exactly how much flour to use to stretch her stores, how to mix in pea flour or acorn flour to extend the wheat, how to judge the fermentation by smell and texture. She knows the difference between dough that has risen enough and dough that has gone too far, becoming sour and difficult. She knows how to shape the loaves so they bake evenly, how to test for doneness by tapping the bottom and listening for the hollow sound. Today's bread will be dark and dense, more brown than white, with a coarse texture that requires long chewing. But it's bread nonetheless, and it will fill stomachs, however temporarily. The wheat flour is mixed with ground peas in equal measure, a combination that produces a heavy loaf, but one that provides sustenance. The acorns she gathered in autumn and laboriously processed, soaking, grinding, soaking again to remove the bitterness, add bulk and a nutty flavour. While the dough rises, Agnes tends to other tasks. She patches a hole in Thomas's spare tunic. He owns two, a luxury of sorts, using thread. She spun last week and a needle made of bone. The hole is in the armpit where the fabric has worn through from constant friction. She cuts a patch from the tail of his old tunic, the one so worn it can no longer be salvaged, and carefully stitches it in place. The sewing is done with care, small stitches that will hold under stress. Clothing is too valuable to replace. It must be maintained, repaired, passed down, till it literally falls apart. Each stitch is even, pulling the edges together without puckering the fabric. Agnes learned this skill from her mother, who learned it from hers, an unbroken line of women knowing how to make things last. Margaret sits nearby, carding wool. The cough interrupts her work periodically, and Agnes watches carefully, judging its severity. The girl's small hands work the cards with growing skill, pulling the fibres straight, preparing them for spinning. She works slowly, stopping often to rest, but she persists without complaint. The cough is loose, which is better than tight. It brings up phlegm, which Agnes interprets as the body purging illness. Still she worries. She has seen loose coughs turn tight, has seen children struggle for breath, while their parents watched helplessly. At midday, she prepares a thin soup from dried peas and the last of the onions. She adds fat from the autumn pig slaughter, just a spoonful, enough to give the soup body and flavour. The pig fat is stored in a clay pot covered with salt to preserve it through winter. Each spoonful represents a calculation, a balance between current need and future scarcity. They eat together, she and Margaret, using the same bowl to save on washing. The soup is hot and filling, and for a brief moment, Agnes feels something like contentment. Margaret blows on each spoonful before eating, her small face serious with concentration. She eats slowly, and Agnes is grateful for this, knowing that slow eating prolongs the feeling of fullness. After the meal, she tends to the cow. The animal is thin, her ribs visible through dull hide, but she still gives a little milk each day. The cow is named Bess, though Agnes rarely uses the name aloud. She is a patient creature, standing quietly while Agnes milks, her warm breath clouding the cold air of the barn. Agnes speaks to the cow as she works, soft, meaningless words that seem to comfort the animal. The cow's warmth radiates in the cold barn, and Agnes presses her face briefly against the rough hide, drawing comfort from the contact. The physical warmth is pleasant, but more than that, there's something soothing about the living presence, the steady breathing, the patient endurance. They are companions in survival, woman and beast. The afternoon passes in the usual way, more spinning, more mending, more wood added carefully to the fire. Margaret sleeps for an hour, exhausted by her cough, and Agnes watches her daughter's face, so young, so thin, so vulnerable. In sleep, Margaret looks even smaller, her body barely making a shape beneath the blanket. The light through the small window shifts from grey to greyer as afternoon wanes toward evening. Agnes marks time by this subtle change, by the increasing need to lean closer to her work to see the stitches. Evening comes early. Agnes bakes the bread, placing the shaped loaves directly in the ashes at the edge of the fire, then covering them with a clay pot to trap the heat. The pot is cracked, but still functional, its surface blackened by years of use. She arranges the coals around it carefully, creating an even heat that will bake the bread through without burning. The smell of baking bread fills the house, a smell both wonderful and painful, because it reminds Agnes of abundance, of harvests, of times when there was enough. When she was newly married, before the hard years, Thomas would sometimes bring her white bread from the manor, a gift from the Lord's table. Those memories seem impossibly distant now, like stories of another life entirely. But the smell brings them back, sharp and sweet and painful. When the bread is done, she breaks it open. The inside steams, releasing a yeasty, earthy smell. She gives Margaret the softest piece, the easiest to chew and digest. The crust goes to Agnes, harder but just as nourishing. They eat slowly, making the bread last. There's nothing else for supper, just bread and water, and a little of the morning's leftover soup, reheated. The water is cold from the bucket, making their teeth ache, but they drink it anyway. Margaret dips her bread in the soup, softening it further, and Agnes notices how the child has learned to make every bite count. After eating, Agnes sits by the fire and continues spinning. Her hands move automatically, requiring no conscious thought, leaving her mind free to wander. The spindle turns, the thread accumulates, and the hours pass in this quiet way. Outside, darkness is complete, and inside, the firelight creates shifting shadows on the walls. She thinks about spring. In spring, Thomas will plough their strips, turning the earth in long furrows that follow the contours of the land. William will return home, taller perhaps, stronger from the labour, ready to take his place as a man. Margaret's cough will ease with the warming air, and she'll run in the fields again, her laughter carrying across the valley. The chickens will lay more eggs, 2 or 3 a day instead of 1 every few days. The cow will give better milk, richer and more abundant, as she grazes on fresh grass. In spring there will be wild greens to gather, nettles, dandelions, sorrel. The hunger will ease as they supplement their stores with fresh food, bitter greens that taste like life itself. The days will lengthen, each sunset coming a little later, each dawn arriving a little earlier. The cold will retreat, releasing its grip on the land and on their bodies. But spring is months away still. Between now and spring lies an expanse of time that feels vast, unbridgeable. There will be February's bitter cold, worse even than January. There will be March winds that cut through clothing and steal warmth from bones. Agnes knows that many will not survive to see spring. Every winter takes some, the very young, the very old, the unlucky. She prays, without much hope, that her family will be spared. She has already lost so much, surely God will not ask more. Prayer is a constant background to Agnes's life. She doesn't attend church regularly, it's too far in winter and she cannot spare the time, but she prays silently throughout the day. The church is 2 miles distant, across fields that become impassable when snow is deep. The priest understands. He knows his parishioners cannot always come to him. She prays while spinning, while tending animals, while lying awake at night. The prayers are simple, repetitive. Keep us safe, keep us warm, keep us alive. Sometimes she prays for specific things, for William's safety, for Margaret's health, for Thomas's return. Other times her prayers are wordless, just a feeling of need sent upward into the darkness. She doesn't expect God to answer directly. God, in her understanding, is distant, concerned with matters far above the struggles of peasant women. The priest speaks of God's love, of his care for even the smallest sparrow, but Agnes finds this hard to reconcile with the suffering she sees around her. Still she prays, because what else can she do? But prayer is a habit, a comfort, a way of naming her fears without drowning in them. It gives shape to the formless dread that sometimes threatens to overwhelm her. The fire burns low. Agnes adds a final piece of wood, then begins preparing for sleep. She banks the coals carefully, covering them with ash to preserve them through the night. To lose the fire completely would mean struggling in the cold morning to create flame from flint and steel, a difficult task with numb fingers. Margaret is already drowsy, her eyes half closed. Agnes helps her daughter into bed, tucking the blanket around her small body. The blanket is wool, woven by Agnes 3 years ago, its surface softened by use, but still providing warmth. She tucks it tight, creating a nest of heat around Margaret's slight form. Then Agnes lies down beside her. Without Thomas, without William, the bed feels vast and cold. She pulls Margaret close, sharing warmth, and closes her eyes. The child's body is warm against hers, a small furnace in the night's cold. Sleep comes slowly. Agnes's mind continues its restless circling, worries about stores, about Margaret's health, about Thomas's safety, about William's welfare. She calculates again the grain remaining, dividing it by weeks until spring, and the numbers don't quite work out. They will need to reduce portions further, or hope for early greens, or beg from neighbors who have little enough themselves. But gradually, exhaustion overcomes worry. Her breathing deepens and slows, her muscles, tense from the day's work, begin to relax. Her last conscious thought is of the morning, of the tasks that will need doing, of the continuation that requires no decision, only persistence. Then sleep takes her. Outside, snow falls again. Inside, the banked fire glows faintly, a small defiance against the vast cold world. Margaret coughs once in her sleep, then settles. The sound barely disturbs Agnes now. She has grown accustomed to it, incorporated it into the background music of their nights. Agnes drifts into dreams, fragmented, strange dreams of summer and childhood, of her mother's face, of fields green and abundant. These dreams offer brief respite from winter's grip. She dreams of running through long grass, her legs young and strong, the sun warm on her shoulders. She dreams of her mother singing, the melody clear and sweet. The night passes, dawn arrives grey and cold, and Agnes wakes to find frost on the inside of the window shutters, patterns like ferns that will melt as the day warms. And the cycle begins again. Fire from coals, water from the well, animals to tend, thread to spin. Days blend into weeks. Thomas returns for brief visits, then leaves again for the manor. When he comes, he brings news from beyond their village, word of other manors, other lords, the larger world that exists beyond their narrow experience. He speaks of the lord's guests, their fine clothes and horses, their laughter over wine. William sends no word. He cannot write, and paid messengers are beyond their means. Agnes must trust that no news means safety, that his silence indicates nothing worse than continued labor. She imagines him often, creates detailed pictures in her mind of what his days must be like. She hopes the people he works for are kind, that they feed him adequately, that they don't demand more than he can give. Margaret's cough persists but doesn't worsen. Agnes continues dosing her with honey and herbs, continues monitoring her breathing, continues worrying. The worry is constant but manageable, a weight she carries along with all the others. She has learned to function with this burden, to work and plan and hope. Despite it, the stores diminish steadily. Agnes recalculates constantly, moving numbers in her head, always arriving at the same conclusion. They will make it through, but barely. She reduces portions again, making the soup thinner, the bread smaller. Margaret doesn't complain, accepting the smaller portions with the same quiet resignation she shows toward everything. One night, a storm arrives. The wind shrieks around the house, finding every gap, every crack, pushing cold air through spaces Agnes didn't know existed. The shutters rattle violently, threatening to tear free from their leather hinges. Agnes and Margaret huddle close to the fire, which flickers and bends with each gust. Snow piles against the door, and Agnes must push with all her strength to open it the next morning. The drift has reached nearly to her waist, and for a moment she wonders if they'll be trapped. She shovels with her hands and a wooden paddle, creating a path just wide enough to pass through. The work leaves her breathless, her muscles trembling. The storm lasts 3 days. During this time, Agnes and Margaret stay inside, venturing out only to tend the animals, wrapped in every piece of cloth they own. The trips to the barn become expeditions, battles against wind and snow. Agnes ties a rope from the door to the barn post so they won't lose their way in the white blindness. The cow and goats must still be fed, still be milked, still be kept alive. Animals cannot wait for better weather. Their needs are constant. The goats huddle together for warmth, their small bodies pressed close. Agnes gives them extra hay, knowing it depletes their stores but unable to let the creatures suffer. On the second day of the storm, Agnes wakes to find the roof leaking. Melting snow has found a weakness in the thatch, and water drips onto the floor near the hearth. She improvises a catch basin using their largest clay pot, positioning it carefully to capture each drop. The sound of water hitting clay becomes a rhythmic counterpoint to the wind's howling, but she knows the leak must be repaired as soon as the weather clears. A leak in winter can destroy a house, letting in moisture that freezes and expands, gradually tearing the structure apart. The damage could spread, could weaken the entire roof structure, could turn their shelter into a ruin. Agnes has seen houses collapse under snow's weight, and the thought terrifies her. When the storm finally breaks, Agnes assesses the damage. The thatch will need reworking, a major job, one she cannot do alone. She climbs onto the roof carefully, testing each step, and finds the damaged area larger than she'd feared. The storm has torn away a section as wide as her arm span. She'll need to beg help from neighbors, offering her own labor in exchange. This is the currency they trade in: hours of work, promises of assistance, the building of obligations that bind the community together. This is how the village survives, through networks of mutual obligation. You help your neighbor fix their roof. They help you mend your fence. You share your fire on the coldest nights. They share their grain when yours runs low. These exchanges are rarely equal, but they're necessary, and over time they balance out. Agnes makes her rounds, speaking to other women, arranging help. The men are mostly away at the manor or at other work, so it's the women who organize, who coordinate, who ensure survival. She visits Joan first, whose daughter married Agnes's cousin. Joan is older, her hands twisted with joint ill, but she can still advise, can still help coordinate. Then Marjorie, who is young and strong, who lost her husband last year and now manages alone with 3 small children, and Alison, whose husband works at the mill, who always seems to have a little extra of everything through careful management. 3 women come to help Agnes with the thatch. They work together on a mild day, fingers stiff with cold, pulling away the damaged section and weaving in new straw. They've brought straw from their own small stores, bundles carried on their backs across the snow. This gift is precious, and Agnes feels the weight of obligation, even as she feels grateful. The work is hard, but there's companionship in it. They talk while they work, quiet gossip, shared complaints, news from the village. Joan's youngest son has taken work at the manor, learning to tend the Lord's horses. Marjorie's mother is ill, not expected to survive until spring. One woman's son has died, taken by winter fever. Agnes offers condolences, understanding the grief intimately, remembering her own lost children. She speaks the customary words, offers the customary comfort, but knows that nothing truly helps such pain. Time softens it, but never erases it. Another woman's husband broke his leg and cannot work. Agnes promises to send Margaret with bread when she can spare it. The woman's eyes fill with tears at this offer, and Agnes understands it's not just the bread, it's the knowledge that she's not alone. These connections sustain Agnes. They remind her that she's not alone, that others share her struggles, that survival is a communal effort. In a world where individuals are fragile, the community becomes essential. They are stronger together than apart, and they know this bone deep. When the thatch is repaired, the women share a meal, thin soup that Agnes has prepared, stretched to feed 4. It's not much, but it's offered with genuine warmth. They sit by the fire, bowls cupped in cold hands, and for a brief time the talk turns lighter. Someone tells a story about the miller's son who fell in love with the Lord's dairymaid. The women laugh, and the sound is strange and wonderful in the winter, quiet house. Agnes feels her spirit lift, feels briefly young again. After the women leave, Agnes sits by the fire and allows herself a moment of gratitude. The roof is fixed, keeping out the weather that could destroy everything they've struggled to maintain. Margaret's cough is improving, each day bringing slightly less rattling in her chest. Thomas will return in 3 days, his presence restoring some balance to their household. William is still alive. She would have heard if he weren't. Bad news travels fast in these parts. Someone would have brought word. These small victories accumulate. They don't erase the hardship, but they make it bearable, give her reason to continue putting one foot in front of the other. Winter deepens. January arrives, the coldest, darkest month, when even the memory of warmth seems impossible. The days are short, the nights endless. The sun, when it appears at all, hangs low and weak, providing light but little heat. Agnes sometimes loses track of time, unsure whether she's been awake for hours or minutes. The dark seems to stretch and compress unpredictably, playing tricks with her perception. But she persists. She spins, she mends, she tends, she rations, she worries, she prays. Each day is a small battle, won simply by surviving it. Each night, when she lies down beside Margaret, she has endured another day, and that endurance itself is victory. Thomas returns for good in late January. The manor has released him, the worst of the work completed, the Lord's preparations adequate to his needs. His presence changes the household, more body heat warming the small space, more strength for heavy tasks like hauling water and wood, more companionship in the long evenings when dark comes early and sleep comes late. He brings news. William will return in February. The work has gone well, his labour satisfactory to his temporary employer. He's earned extra grain, not much, but enough to ease the final months of winter. The grain will arrive with William, carried on his back across the frozen miles. Agnes receives this news with quiet relief. She allows herself to imagine reunion, imagine all 4 of them together again, warm and fed and alive. She imagines William's return, how he'll have grown, how his voice might have deepened. She imagines spring arriving, the snow melting, the first green shoots pushing through thawed earth. The days continue their slow passage. Agnes's life doesn't change in any dramatic way. There are no sudden reversals, no miraculous abundances, just the steady, grinding continuation of winter existence. Wake, tend fire, tend animals, ration food, spin thread, mend clothes, sleep, wake again. But something shifts inside her. Perhaps it's the knowledge that the worst is past, that they've survived the deepest cold and darkest days. Perhaps it's the return of Thomas, his solid presence a reminder that she's not alone in this struggle. Perhaps it's simply exhaustion giving way to a kind of numb endurance that makes the days pass more easily. She sits one evening by the fire, spinning, and realizes she's humming a tune her mother used to sing, a simple melody that speaks of spring and growing things. The sound surprises her. She hasn't hummed in months, maybe longer. Margaret looks up, surprised by the sound, and smiles. Her daughter's smile, rare these days, lights her small face and makes her look, briefly, like a child instead of a miniature adult burdened with survival. In that moment, Agnes feels something she hasn't felt in weeks. Hope. Not certainty, not confidence, but simple hope. The belief that they will survive, that spring will come, that life will continue. She doesn't speak this hope aloud. To speak it might break its fragile spell, might invite fate's attention. Instead, she keeps spinning, keeps humming, keeps the fire burning. These actions themselves become a form of prayer, a wordless assertion that they will endure. The story of Agnes is the story of countless women, countless winters. There's no single dramatic event, no climactic moment that changes everything. Just daily persistence, quiet courage, the accumulation of small survivals that add up to a life. Each day survived is a small thread, and these threads weave together into the fabric of years. She endures. That is her heroism, not a single act of bravery, but the daily choice to continue, to care, to work, to hope. She persists. That is her triumph, not a victory over winter, but a stubborn refusal to surrender to it, to let it break her or define her completely. And when spring finally arrives, as it always has, as she trusts it always will, she'll emerge from winter changed but unbroken, ready to begin the cycle again. The scars will be there, invisible but present, but so will the knowledge that she survived, and that survival itself is enough. Now we drift into different territory, into the realm of mystery and half-remembered meaning. Let your mind settle into these questions without demanding answers, for some aspects of medieval winter life remain opaque to us, obscured by centuries and the loss of oral tradition. Consider the hearthstone, worn smooth not by fire but by hands, generations of hands touching the same spot as they passed the fire, day after day, year after year. In excavations of medieval peasant houses, these hearthstones show patterns of wear that suggest ritual touching, deliberate contact, as though the stone itself held power or meaning beyond its practical function. Why did they touch these stones? We can speculate, but we cannot know with certainty. Perhaps it was a gesture of gratitude to the fire, a superstitious insurance against the flame dying. Perhaps it connected the living to the dead, to all those ancestors who had touched the same stone in their own desperate winters. The wear patterns themselves tell stories our instruments can measure but our minds struggle to interpret. Archaeologists have documented how the smooth depressions in these stones follow curves that match human palm placement, how the depth suggests not casual contact but deliberate, repeated pressing. The stones remember what the people have forgotten. Some stones bear marks, crude crosses, circles, symbols that resist interpretation. Were these protective wards, prayers made physical, simple decoration to pass the endless winter hours? The crosses are rarely perfect, their arms uneven, their angles crude. This suggests they were carved not by craftsmen but by ordinary people, perhaps in moments of fear or hope or simple boredom. The circles, when examined closely, often contain smaller marks within them, dots, lines, patterns that might be letters in an alphabet we don't recognize or might be nothing more than idle scratching. The truth is lost. We have the stones, the wear patterns, the marks, but we've lost the stories, the beliefs, the quiet certainties that made these actions meaningful. What remains is the evidence of human hands, human needs, human attempts to impose meaning on the relentless cold. These stones anchored households for generations, the one permanent feature in homes that might be rebuilt, re-roofed, restructured, but always around the same hearth, the same fire, the same stone that had served great-grandparents and would serve great-grandchildren. Throughout medieval villages, we find evidence of domestic rituals that blur the line between practical care and spiritual protection. Bundles of dried herbs hung above doorways, rosemary, vervain, juniper, placed there for reasons that combined medicine, magic, and tradition in ways that medieval people themselves might not have distinguished. These herbs would have released faint scents when brushed against. They may have helped mask the smell of close quarters and unwashed bodies. They may have had genuine antimicrobial properties that reduced disease. But they were also believed to ward off evil, to protect the household from malevolent forces that grew stronger in winter's darkness. The line between what worked and what was believed to work was thin, porous, often irrelevant. The bundles themselves were often elaborate constructions, tied with specific types of cord, arranged in particular patterns. Some contained not just herbs but other objects, a nail wrapped in the center, a scrap of parchment with words written in hands, barely literate, a bird's feather, a piece of iron shaped into a hook or ring. Each element contributed to the bundle's power, though what power and by what mechanism remains mysterious. In the archaeological record, we find strange deposits beneath thresholds, small caches of objects carefully placed during construction or repair. A handful of grain, a bent nail, a fragment of pottery, a chicken bone. These foundation deposits appear across medieval Europe, varying by region but following similar patterns. They seem to be offerings, gifts to whatever spirit or force inhabited or protected the dwelling. The grain speaks of prosperity, of abundance, of the hope that the household would never go hungry. The bent nail might have been iron's protective power, might have been a binding element, might have been simple availability, a nail being one of the few metal objects a peasant might possess. The pottery fragment often shows evidence of having been from a vessel that held something important: wine, oil, preserved food, as though the container's memory of abundance could be transferred to the house itself. What did medieval peasants believe about their houses? Did they think of them as living things, as containers for ancestral presence, as fragile bubbles of safety in a hostile world requiring constant supernatural maintenance? The evidence suggests all of these understandings coexisted, layered atop one another without contradiction. A house was simultaneously a physical structure, a spiritual entity, a connection to the past, and a projection into the future. To separate these meanings would have been as strange to medieval people as our separation of them would seem natural to us. We know they named their houses, or at least their hearths. We have records of people referring to "my father's fire" or "the fire of our house," as though the fire itself was an entity, a member of the family. In legal documents from the period, we find references to fires as property that could be inherited, divided, or contested. A man might leave his fire and its keeping to his eldest son with specific instructions about maintaining it. This suggests the fire was not merely a practical necessity but a valuable possession, perhaps the most valuable possession a peasant household owned. The hearth was sacred space. To let it die completely was considered deeply unlucky, a break in the household's continuity. Some families maintained the same fire for generations, carrying coals from old house to new when they moved, ensuring the ancestral flame continued unbroken. This continuity of fire represents a continuity of life itself, a chain extending backward through time to ancestors whose names might be forgotten but whose presence remained in the living flame. When a fire died completely, something more than heat was lost. The link to the past was severed, and with it, perhaps, the protection or blessing that past generations provided. In winter, when darkness dominated, fire took on even greater significance. It was the only light, the only warmth, the only thing that made life possible. Is it any wonder they treated it with reverence? The fire's glow created the boundaries of the human world. Beyond its light lay darkness absolute, cold that could kill, night that stretched for 16 hours or more. The fire was not just a comfort, but the definition of survival. The marker between life and death, civilization and wilderness, human and animal. Consider the practice of banking coals at night, covering them with ash to preserve them until morning. This was practical necessity, yes, but the care with which it was done, the specific rituals that developed around it, suggest deeper meaning. The ash had to be placed just so, not smothering the coals completely, but insulating them, allowing them to breathe while conserving their heat. Too much ash and the fire would die. Too little, and it would burn through the fuel and exhaust itself before dawn. The skill required was considerable, passed from parent to child, refined over generations. Some families said prayers while banking the fire. Others performed small gestures, placing the ash in a specific pattern, leaving a gap for the fire to breathe, setting aside the best coals in a particular position. These rituals ensured the fire's survival through the night, but they also enacted a symbolic death and rebirth. Each morning, coaxing the fire back to life became a daily resurrection, a triumph over darkness and cold. The moment of revival was anxious. You could do everything right, and still the fire might fail. The coals might have burned too low. The night might have been too cold. Those first breaths blown onto the hidden coals, watching for the faint glow that meant life remained, waiting for the smoke that preceded flame. These were moments of genuine uncertainty, small dramas of survival enacted every morning. Winter solstice held particular significance, the longest night, the turning point after which days would slowly lengthen. Medieval peasants marked this moment with rituals that Christianity had partly absorbed, partly suppressed, but never fully eliminated. The Church provided its own interpretation, the birth of Christ as the return of the light, the sun entering the darkest moment to bring salvation. But beneath this Christian overlay, older meanings persisted, meanings connected to the solar cycle itself, to the anxiety that the sun might not return, that winter might continue forever. The Yule log is well documented, a massive piece of wood, carefully selected, brought into the house with ceremony, and burned throughout the 12 days of Christmas. But the deeper meanings are obscure. The log was often from a fruit tree, apple or cherry, and was decorated before burning. Families saved a piece of the previous year's log to light the new one, creating continuity across years. Why fruitwood? Why preserve a piece? The Christian explanations speak of Jesus as light of the world, of continuity of faith, but the practices predate Christianity in these regions, suggesting older meanings about fertility, about ensuring the sun's return, about sympathetic magic linking fire to the growth of crops. Fruit trees in winter are dead seeming bare, offering no evidence that life persists within them. Yet they will bloom again in spring, will bear fruit, will sustain human life. To burn fruit wood at winter's depth might have been a way of affirming this cycle, of insisting that death is temporary, that life will return. The preservation of a piece to light next year's log creates a chain of fire across time, each year's light giving birth to the next, just as each year's harvest provides seed for the next planting. We find charred wood fragments carefully buried near houses, wrapped in cloth placed with evident care. Were these remains of Yule logs, offerings to ensure good harvests, protection against lightning strikes, which medieval people believed fire could attract or repel? Some of these fragments show evidence of having been carved or marked before burial. Symbols appear on the charred surfaces, marks that might be letters, might be sigils, might be nothing more than decorative notches. The cloth wrapping suggests these were valuable, important, worthy of preservation and careful placement. The mystery deepens when we examine winter burial practices. In areas where ground was frozen solid for months, the dead had to wait for spring burial. Bodies were kept in various ways, in outbuildings, in church crypts if the family had means, or sometimes in interim graves that would be reopened in spring. The practical problem of winter death was considerable. Bodies could not be left in living quarters. The smell, the fear, the simple fact of death's presence would make the space uninhabitable, but neither could they be properly buried when the ground was frozen iron hard. The solutions varied, but all involved a temporary state and neither here nor there existence for the deceased. But some bodies were buried immediately despite frozen ground, at considerable effort and expense. Why these people? What made their immediate burial so important? The effort required to dig a grave in frozen ground is difficult to overstate. Fires would need to be built on the grave site to thaw the earth, maintained for hours or even days. Then the partially thawed ground would need to be dug, often revealing another frozen layer beneath, requiring another fire, another wait. A burial that might take a few hours in summer could take days in deep winter, requiring enormous labor and fuel. The graves themselves sometimes contain unusual arrangements. Bodies positioned in non-standard ways, objects placed at head or feet, coins, small bells, iron nails, pieces of bread. Some archaeologists interpret these as Christian burial practices. Others see evidence of folk beliefs about the dead, about the special dangers of winter death, about the need to speed the soul's departure or bind it to prevent wandering. The coins might have been payment for the journey, an echo of classical beliefs about paying the ferryman, or they might have been the deceased's own coins, buried with them as property. The bells are harder to explain. Were they meant to alert the living if the dead should wake? Were they protective devices, their sound warding off evil? The iron nails suggest binding, preventing return, or perhaps protection, iron being powerful against supernatural forces. Medieval people believed the dead were most restless in winter. The long nights, the darkness, the time when the boundary between worlds grew thin. All of this made winter a season of ghosts, of ancestors, of the uncanny. The logic makes a certain sense. Winter was when death came most frequently, when the old and the weak succumbed to cold and hunger. Winter was when darkness dominated, when the ordered visible world retreated and the unknown expanded. If the dead were to walk, winter nights would be when they walked, Did they fear their own dead? Did they honor them? Both, perhaps. The relationship between living and dead was complex, involving obligations that extended beyond the grave. Family dead were both protective and potentially dangerous. A well-honored ancestor might watch over descendants, might intercede with higher powers, might provide warnings through dreams or signs. But a neglected or angry ancestor might curse the living, might cause illness or misfortune, might need to be appeased through offerings or rituals. Consider the practice of leaving food offerings on winter nights, a bit of bread on the windowsill, a cup of ale poured onto the threshold, a portion of the family meal set aside. Christianity taught charity to the living poor, but these offerings were rarely claimed by beggars. They were left to freeze, to be eaten by animals, or to simply disappear overnight. Were they feeding ghosts, appeasing house spirits, ensuring the goodwill of whatever forces inhabited the winter darkness? The practices persisted across centuries despite church disapproval, suggesting deep-rooted belief. The food itself was often the family's best, not scraps, but actual portions of bread, cheese, whatever the household was eating. This sacrifice suggests the offerings were important, directed toward beings or forces whose favor mattered. The placement on thresholds is significant, thresholds being liminal spaces, neither inside nor outside, where the human world met the other world. We find evidence, too, of dream interpretation holding special weight in winter. The long nights brought long sleep, and sleep brought dreams, vivid, sometimes disturbing dreams that medieval people treated as meaningful. Dreams of dead relatives were particularly significant. A dead father appearing to give advice, a dead mother warning of danger. These dreams were taken seriously, their messages heeded. The content of these dreams, when recorded, often involves practical matters. The dead father advises where to plant a particular crop. The dead mother warns of a neighbor's illness. These are not mystical revelations but practical guidance, as though the dead continued to care for the living, continued to possess knowledge useful to daily survival. Did medieval peasants believe in a spirit world that became more accessible in winter? Did they think the dead could communicate through dreams? The records are fragmentary but suggestive. Some accounts describe dreams not as random images but as actual visits, as though the dreamer traveled to where the dead resided or the dead traveled to the dreamer's sleep. The boundary between sleeping and waking, like the boundary between living and dead, became permeable in winter's long darkness. Folk remedies for winter illnesses combined material and mystical elements in ways that defy our categories. A poultice of herbs was also a prayer. A healing draught was prepared at a specific time of day, under specific conditions, with specific words spoken. We have recipes preserved in later herbals, but the context is lost. When the recipe says to gather herbs at dawn on the third day after the new moon, is that because the herb's properties peaked then, or because that timing held spiritual significance, or both? The distinction might not have existed for medieval people. If dawn on the third day after the new moon was when the herbs were most powerful, that power might be simultaneously physical and spiritual, the plant's medicinal properties and its magical efficacy being aspects of the same reality rather than separate phenomena requiring separate explanations. Honey mixed with garlic and applied to the chest for coughs. This has genuine antimicrobial properties. But it was also believed to work because honey came from bees, creatures associated with purity and resurrection, and garlic warded off evil influences. The remedy worked on multiple levels simultaneously. It treated the physical illness, it engaged spiritual protection, it gave the patient and family a sense of agency and hope. To separate these functions is to misunderstand how medieval people experienced illness. Illness was never purely physical. The body's suffering was always entangled with spiritual state, with moral standing, with the patient's relationship to divine and supernatural forces. To treat only the body would be foolish. The whole person, the whole situation required attention. Winter sickness was seen as both natural and supernatural. Yes, the cold caused illness, they understood that. But why did some people sicken and others stay healthy? Why did some recover while others died? These questions demanded explanations beyond the physical. Bad air, yes. Imbalance of humors, certainly. But also divine punishment, witchcraft, the evil eye, malign spirits taking advantage of winter weakness. The randomness of disease and death was intolerable. If illness struck without pattern or reason, then life was chaos, survival was luck, effort and virtue meant nothing. Better to believe in causes, even dark causes, than to accept meaningless suffering. Better to believe protection was possible through right action than to accept helplessness. Protection required multiple strategies: keep warm, eat well, rest, practical measures, but also pray. Wear protective amulets, avoid cursed places, maintain household rituals that kept evil at bay. We find small objects carefully sewn into clothing, a scrap of parchment with a prayer, a dried flower, a pebble from a holy well. These were talismans, protecting the wearer from both physical cold and spiritual danger. The prayers on parchment were often barely legible, written by hands unused to writing, the letters malformed but sincere. Some were abbreviated, single words or phrases rather than complete prayers. Lord mercy, Mary protect, Saint save. The The shorthand suggests these were memory aids, reminders of longer prayers the wearer would speak mentally, or perhaps the written word itself held power, regardless of its readability. Children were considered especially vulnerable in winter. Their mortality rates spiked dramatically during the cold months, and parents took elaborate precautions. Some of these precautions we understand, keeping children close to the fire, ensuring they ate first from scarce supplies, wrapping them in extra layers. Others are more mysterious. Why did parents tie red thread around a baby's wrist in winter? Why were certain prayers said only over children when snow was falling? Why were some children given new names midwinter, as if to confuse death or evil spirits seeking them? The red thread appears in multiple contexts across medieval Europe, sometimes on the wrist, sometimes on the ankle, sometimes woven into a child's clothing. Red being the color of blood, of life, might have been a way of asserting the child's vitality, their claim on life against winter's deadly reach. Or red might have been protective, visible to human and supernatural eyes alike as a mark of care, of attention, of parental love standing between child and harm. The archaeological record offers tantalizing glimpses: children's graves with unusual grave goods, tiny amulets designed for infant wear, evidence of rituals performed specifically for the young. But the meanings are lost. We have the objects, the practices, but not the beliefs that made them coherent. One child's grave from a northern English village contained a small wooden doll, a handful of hazelnuts, and a piece of honeycomb. Why these objects? Were they the child's treasures, buried with them as comfort for the next world? Were they offerings, bribes to supernatural forces to treat the child gently? Were they symbolic, the doll representing the child's innocence, the hazelnuts representing potential unrealized, the honeycomb representing sweetness cut short? Consider also the practice of wassailing, going door to door in winter, singing, expecting food and drink in return. This is often presented as mere begging or entertainment, but the songs themselves suggest deeper meaning. The wassailers blessed the houses they visited. They sang of prosperity, of protection, of the turning year. To turn them away without offering was considered deeply unlucky. You were refusing the blessing, inviting misfortune. The exchange was not charity but transaction, blessing for sustenance, song for drink, goodwill for hospitality. The wassailers provided a service, their songs carrying power to ensure the household's survival through winter and prosperity in the year to come. The songs themselves are strange when examined closely. They speak of apple trees in winter, of fertility in barren season, of death and resurrection. They invoke powers that are neither clearly Christian nor clearly pagan. References to the green man appear, to holly and ivy, to the battle between winter and summer, to ancient trees and sacred groves. These are not church-sanctioned images, but older symbols that Christianity never fully suppressed, that persisted in folk practice long after official conversion. Who were the wassailers, really? Were they ordinary villagers? Or did they fulfill a quasi-priestly function, carrying winter blessings from house to house? The line between secular and sacred was not clear. In some regions, wassailers wore masks or costumes, disguising their identities. Were they then acting as themselves or as representatives of something else? Spirits, ancestors, the forces of the season itself? The disguise suggests they became, temporarily, something other than ordinary humans, vehicles for powers that required human voice and movement to manifest in the world. We find evidence of boundary rituals, practices performed at the edges of fields, at crossroads, at the boundaries between village and wilderness. In winter, these boundaries required special attention. Farmers would walk their field boundaries on certain winter nights, carrying torches, singing or praying. Why? To mark their territory, to warn off spirits, to ensure the land would remember its human masters when spring came. The ritual walking recreated ownership, reinforced human claim on land that winter's snow had rendered anonymous and wild. Each step was an assertion, "This is ours, we will return, we have not abandoned this soil." The torchlight pushed back darkness, creating temporary circles of human space in winter's blank expanse. Some boundary markers show evidence of repeated burning at their bases, as though fires were regularly lit there. Some have small pits nearby containing ash, charred grain, and bones, offerings of some kind. The offerings suggest the boundaries were not just legal or practical, but spiritual, places where human and other than human made agreements, where the right to farm, to live, to exist on this particular land was negotiated with forces whose permission or tolerance was required. The wilderness was dangerous in medieval understanding, physically, yes, but also spiritually. It was where ordered Christian civilization ended and chaos began. In winter, when snow obscured familiar landmarks, the wilderness seemed to expand, threatening to reclaim human space. The forest in winter became even more forest-like, more itself, more alien to human habitation. The paths disappeared under snow, the familiar trees became anonymous shapes. The usual sounds were replaced by silence or by wind that howled with what sounded like voices. To venture into winter wilderness was to risk losing your way, your life, your very self. Maintaining boundaries was therefore both practical and symbolic, a way of asserting human presence, human order, human right, to exist in the midst of winter's blank expanse. Inside the house, other mysteries accumulated. Why did families place their shoes in specific positions before sleeping? Why were beds positioned to avoid certain orientations? Why was it considered unlucky to spin thread after sunset during certain winter weeks? The shoes were often placed heels together, toes pointing outward, or all pointing in the same direction, toward the door or toward the hearth, never toward the bed. This suggests beliefs about feet, about walking, about the soul's potential to wander during sleep and needing guidance or restraint or direction to return properly to the body. These practices formed a complex web of belief and behavior, much of it now incomprehensible. We can document that people did these things. We can rarely say with confidence why they mattered. Some scholars argue we shouldn't even try, that imposing our explanations on medieval practices is a form of intellectual colonialism, forcing past beliefs into modern frameworks where they don't fit. Others argue that understanding is possible, that through careful study of fragmentary sources, we can reconstruct at least some of what these rituals meant to those who performed them. Perhaps the truth lies between we can understand some things dimly, partially, but much remains and will always remain mysterious. We can trace patterns, note similarities across regions, identify possible influences and precedents. But the lived experience, the actual feeling of performing these rituals, the emotional and spiritual reality of medieval winter life, is beyond our reach, separated from us by an unbridgeable gap of time and worldview. The winter night itself held meaning we struggled to grasp. For us, night is an inconvenience, easily banished with electric light. For medieval peasants, night was a different world, darker than we can imagine, full of sounds and absences that signified in ways we've forgotten. Our darkness is never complete. Streetlights, the glow of distant cities, the moon reflecting off light pollution. We live in perpetual twilight, never experiencing the utter blackness that medieval people knew. Their darkness was absolute, total, a thing with presence and weight and character. They listened to winter nights, the creak of freezing wood, the sound of snow falling on thatch, the distant howl of wolves, the wind's voice in the chimney. Each sound carried information, required interpretation. The house itself spoke at night, beams contracting in cold, thatch settling, the fire's voice changing as it burned down to coals. These sounds were familiar, expected, comforting in their predictability. But unfamiliar sounds demanded attention. Was that footsteps? An animal on the roof? Something pressing against the door? Some sounds were good omens, the call of certain birds, the crack of ice forming on the well, the particular way wind sang through bare branches. Others were ill omens, sounds that suggested danger, death, or supernatural presence. We've lost the ability to read these signs. We've lost even the knowledge that they were signs requiring reading. To medieval people, winter night was a text full of meaning for those who knew how to interpret it. Each village would have had its own vocabulary of sounds, its own interpretations passed down through generations. The old would teach the young that sound means the ice is safe, that sound means a storm approaches, that sound means nothing, ignore it, that sound means wake everyone and prepare. Dreams, as mentioned earlier, held special significance, but winter dreams were different from summer dreams, deeper, stranger, more meaningful. The long sleep of winter nights allowed for dreams that felt like journeys, like communications from beyond the ordinary world. People shared their dreams, interpreted them communally, used them to make decisions about practical matters. A dream of wheat might suggest where to plant come spring. A dream of a dead relative might warn of coming illness. The communal interpretation was important. Dreams were not private phenomena, but messages that affected the whole household or village. If a respected elder dreamed of fire, that was everyone's concern, requiring discussion and perhaps action. Dreams were intelligence from the spirit world, requiring collective wisdom to decode. Were they right to take dreams so seriously? From our perspective, dreams are random neural firing, the brain processing information during sleep. But medieval people experienced dreams as real, as meaningful, as connected to truth in ways we dismiss. And perhaps they knew something we don't. Perhaps the attention they paid to their inner lives, to the messages of sleep and darkness, gave them access to intuition, to pattern recognition, to forms of knowledge we've lost in our bright, busy, externally focused modern existence. Dreams can synthesize information the conscious mind hasn't fully processed. Dreams can alert us to patterns we've observed but not consciously noted. The medieval practice of heeding dreams might have been, in effect, a way of accessing this unconscious processing, of taking seriously what their minds were trying to tell them. The archaeology of medieval winter life continues to surprise us. Recent excavations have revealed practices we never suspected, objects whose purposes remain unclear. In one northern village, excavators found beneath multiple house floors a consistent pattern, 3 stones arranged in a triangle, with charcoal and grain seeds at the center. Every house the same pattern. Why? What did it mean? Was it foundation ritual, protection magic, a way of consecrating domestic space? The villagers left no written record and the practice eventually disappeared. The consistency suggests teaching, tradition, something everyone knew was necessary when building a house. The 3 stones might represent past, present, and future, or father, mother, and child, or earth, heaven, and the human realm between. The charcoal could be previous fires, continuity of the hearth. The grain could be prosperity, sustenance, the hope that this house would always have food. In another site, winter deposits in a midden heap revealed organized layers, refuse sorted and arranged with evident care, alternating food waste with ash, bones with pottery shards, in patterns that suggest ritual disposal rather than mere trash discard. Were they treating their waste as offerings? Returning to Earth what Earth had given. The effort involved argues for something beyond practical disposal. Medieval people lived closer to their waste than we do, couldn't escape the reality of consumption and disposal. Perhaps this intimacy required ritual acknowledgement, ways of making the return of waste to soil meaningful rather than simply necessary. Perhaps the layering was prayer made physical. Thank you for sustenance. Here is what remains. May it feed the earth as earth fed us. We find caches of winter-gathered objects, dried flowers from hedgerows, specific types of stones, carefully preserved bird feathers. Some were clearly medicinal, others resist explanation. One cache contained 37 pebbles, each one smooth and dark, each one marked with a single scratch. Were they counting stones, prayer beads, game pieces, magical objects? We cannot know. The number 37 is oddly specific. Not 40, not 30, not 50. Did it represent something? Days until spring, household members living and dead, the collector's age, the number of winters they'd survived. Each stone, carefully marked with a single scratch, suggests deliberate collection, patient accumulation over time. The mystery is humbling. We have advanced technology, sophisticated analytical methods, vast databases of comparative material. Yet medieval peasants' inner lives, their actual beliefs about winter and survival, and the forces that shape their existence, remain largely opaque. We can carbon date their artifacts, analyze their bones for diet and disease, map their settlements with ground-penetrating radar, but we cannot enter their minds, cannot feel what they felt, cannot think their thoughts. The gap between material evidence and lived experience remains vast. We can describe what they did, we struggle to understand why it mattered to them, and in that gap between description and understanding, we confront the limits of historical knowledge. Perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps some mysteries should remain mysterious, reminding us that past people were not like us, did not think like us, inhabited a world of meaning we can barely glimpse. To claim complete understanding would be arrogance. To claim their world is fully accessible to our analytical tools would be to diminish the strangeness, the otherness, the genuine alienness of medieval consciousness. They were human, yes, but human in ways we can only partially reconstruct. What we can say with certainty, medieval peasants possessed knowledge we've lost. They read landscapes, seasons, and signs with a sophistication born of necessity. They knew how to exist in winter without modern comforts, how to survive through observation, tradition, and practices we call superstition, but which functioned as technology of the spirit. Their knowledge was embodied, practiced, transmitted through demonstration and repetition rather than written record. They knew by doing, by feeling, by attention, sustained over lifetimes. The gap between their knowledge and ours is not just that they knew different things, but that they knew differently through different modes of consciousness and attention. They knew intimately that the world was full of forces beyond human control, and they developed elaborate strategies for negotiating with those forces, through ritual, through offering, through careful attention to the rhythms of the year. This knowledge was pragmatic, not mystical. It worked, not in the sense that the supernatural forces they believed in were real, but in the sense that their practices helped them survive, gave them psychological resources to endure winter's hardships, maintained social cohesion, passed crucial information across generations. Whether those forces were real or imagined is perhaps the wrong question. What matters is that medieval people experienced them as real, structured their lives accordingly, and survived centuries of winters using knowledge systems we've discarded as ignorant superstition. The rituals created meaning, provided structure, gave agency in situations where practical agency was limited. You couldn't control the weather, but you could perform the rituals that honored winter's power. You couldn't prevent all illness, but you could take every precaution, both physical and spiritual, and know you'd done everything possible. As you drift towards sleep tonight, in your warm house, with electric lights banishing darkness at your command, consider what's been lost. Not just hardship, we're grateful to have left that behind, but knowledge, sensitivity, attention to subtle realities that modern life makes invisible. We've gained so much: comfort, longevity, freedom from winter's worst cruelties. But we've lost the intimacy with cold, with darkness, with the sharp edge of survival that made every spring a genuine victory, every winter survived a genuine achievement. Medieval winter wisdom was hard-won, passed down through generations, encoded in ritual and practice that kept people alive when survival was never guaranteed. Much of that wisdom is gone now, dissolved by modernity like snow in spring rain. The last practitioners of these rituals died generations ago. Their children, moving into a world of electric light and central heating, saw no need to learn the old ways. The knowledge that sustained humanity through thousands of winters evaporated within a century or two of technological change. But traces remain, archaeological oddities, fragmentary documents, folk practices that persist without explanation. And in those traces, if we look carefully, if we approach with humility, we can glimpse something of how our ancestors understood and navigated the winter world, a world stranger, darker, more layered with meaning than we can easily imagine from our comfortable present. These traces invite us not to romanticize the past, but to recognize its genuine strangeness, its difference from our present. Medieval people were not primitive versions of us, but fully human beings operating within a worldview we can study but never fully inhabit, navigating challenges we've conquered, but in doing so have forgotten how to truly understand. Let us shift now from the dark village houses to the stone manor perched on the hill above. From below, you might have seen its small windows glowing with firelight on winter evenings, smoke rising from multiple chimneys, and wondered what life was like behind those thick walls. The manor house is built of stone, grey limestone quarried locally and mortared together by masons who learned their craft from their fathers. It's not a castle, not quite, but it's substantial, built to last, built to impress, built to shelter the lord and his household through seasons that threaten everyone, rich and poor alike. Lord Robert de Fenton, Agnes's lord, the man who owns the land her husband works, is 47 years old this winter. He's a minor nobleman holding land from a greater lord who holds from the king, bound in chains of obligation that stretch upward through society just as they stretch downward to the peasants. His hall is the heart of the manor, a large open room with a high ceiling supported by dark beams. At one end sits the lord's table, raised on a low platform. Along the walls, trestle tables for lesser members of the household. The floor is stone, covered partially with rushes that are changed regularly, not daily, as in summer, but weekly, or when the smell grows too strong. The rushes help with insulation, creating a slight barrier against the cold rising from stone. 3 fireplaces serve the hall. 3, a luxury beyond imagining for the peasants below. 1 large hearth at the centre, 2 smaller ones built into walls, all burning steadily through the winter months. The wood these fires consume is staggering. Lord Robert's servants, the same men who labour alongside peasants like Agnes's Thomas, spend days felling trees, cutting them into logs, stacking them in vast woodsheds built specifically for winter storage. Even so, the hall is never truly warm. Stand near the fire and you might be comfortable. Move 20 feet away and your breath mists, your hands stiffen. The stone walls radiate cold inward, and despite the fires, despite the tapestries hung to provide insulation, winter penetrates everywhere. Lord Robert wears layers, linen shirt against his skin, wool tunic over that, fur-lined surcoat on top. His clothing is fine quality, professionally tailored, but the principle is the same as Agnes's layering. Trap air, hold heat, survive. His wife, Lady Eleanor, wears heavy gowns with long sleeves and high necklines, and over these, mantles lined with squirrel fur. She's rarely without a fur-lined cloak when moving through the manor's corridors, which function as wind tunnels, channeling cold through the building. They have bedchambers separate from the hall, a mark of status and wealth. These rooms are smaller, easier to heat, furnished with enclosed beds that can be curtained off to trap warmth during the night. The bed itself is a marvel compared to Agnes's straw mattress, a wooden frame supporting a mattress stuffed with wool, and down, covered with linen sheets, wool blankets, and fur coverlets. At its foot sits a warming pan, filled with coals from the fire and placed between the sheets before sleeping. Yet even in this bed, in this private chamber, the cold intrudes. Windows are covered with oiled cloth or thin scraped horn. Glass is far too expensive, and the wind finds every gap. Frost forms on the inside of window coverings. Water left in a basin freezes overnight. Lord Robert rises each morning as Agnes does to cold and darkness. His fire has been kept alive through the night by a servant assigned specifically to this task, a young man who sleeps in the corridor outside, who must wake periodically to add wood, whose position is considered desirable despite the interrupted sleep. The morning routine differs from Agnes's, but recognizably parallels it. A servant brings water warmed at the kitchen fire. Another helps Lord Robert dress, layering the garments in proper order. A third attends Lady Eleanor in her chamber. Breakfast is served in the hall, bread, cold meat left from yesterday, small beer or watered wine. The food is better quality than Agnes would ever taste, but the meal itself is simple, functional, designed to fuel the day without ceremony. After breakfast, Lord Robert's day unfolds in ways that seem leisurely compared to peasant labour, but which carry their own pressures and purposes. In winter, with field work impossible, a nobleman's concerns turn to indoor matters, administration, planning, maintaining social networks. He meets with his steward, reviewing accounts. How much grain remains in storage? What are the livestock numbers? Which tenants have paid their rents, which have fallen behind? These details matter. The estate's survival depends on careful management. The steward is educated. He can read, write, calculate. He presents information written on parchment, and Lord Robert squints at it in the dim light of winter morning, trying to make decisions that will affect not just his family, but everyone who depends on his land. Should he sell grain now when prices are reasonable, or hold it until spring when scarcity might drive prices higher, but when his own people might starve? Should he forgive rent for tenants whose children have died, showing Christian mercy, or hold firm, maintaining the economic structure that keeps the estate functioning? These are not abstract questions. Faces come with them: Agnes's face, Thomas's face, the faces of dozens of people he knows, whose families have worked this land for generations. Lord Robert is not cruel. He's not particularly kind either. He's trapped in systems of obligation as surely as Agnes is, answering to lords above him who demand revenues, who can strip him of his lands if he fails to meet his obligations. After meeting with the steward, he might inspect the manor's defences, not elaborate fortifications, just basic walls and gates that need periodic maintenance. In winter, this means checking that gates still open despite ice, that walls haven't been damaged by frost heave. Or he might spend time in what passes for a library, a chest containing perhaps a dozen books, each one worth more than a peasant family's yearly labour. These books are religious mostly: a Bible, a Psalter, a Book of Hours, plus perhaps a romance or chronicle in French. Lord Robert reads Latin adequately, French fluently. These languages mark him as educated, separate him from the English-speaking peasants below. His education was expensive, involving years with a tutor when he was young, and he maintains it now partly for practical reasons, partly for status. Reading passes the dark afternoon hours. The light is poor even at midday in winter, so reading must be done near windows or by many candles, another expense that's noteworthy even for a noble household. Lady Eleanor's day follows its own pattern. She oversees the household servants, the women who spin, weave, and sew, creating the endless textile products the manor requires. Fine cloth for the lord's family, coarser cloth for servants, repairs to damaged items, new garments for all. She might work alongside them, her fingers moving in the same motions as Agnes's, though the materials she works are finer: silk thread from distant lands, delicate linen, wool so carefully prepared it feels almost soft. She manages the still room where medicines and preserves are prepared. Her knowledge of herbs rivals Agnes's, though she learned it from books and tutors rather than from her mother's teaching. The distinction matters socially but not practically. Both women know how to ease a fever, treat a cough, prepare a sleeping draught. She visits the chapel daily. The manor has its own small chapel with a resident priest who says Mass each morning. Lady Eleanor attends, prays, finds in religious observance both genuine devotion and social duty. The two are inseparable. Meals structure the day. Dinner, the main meal, is served at midday when light is best. The household gathers in the hall, sitting in strict order of precedence. The lord and lady at the high table, officers and important servants at tables below, ordinary servants standing or eating elsewhere. The food is abundant compared to peasant fare. Multiple courses, roasted meats, pies, bread, made from wheat flour, wine or ale to drink. But even this abundance is rationed, calculated, managed. The cook works from stores that must last until spring. Each meal depletes those stores, and careful planning ensures the household won't run short before new supplies arrive. Winter dining includes preserved foods that seem exotic to us: salted meat, smoked fish, pickled vegetables, dried fruits from autumn. Fresh food is rare, limited to whatever livestock can be slaughtered, whatever roots remain in storage. The hall fills with bodies, with talk, with the warmth that many people generate when gathered together. For a brief time, the cold seems held at bay, and there's something approaching cheerfulness in the company. But the meal ends. People disperse to their tasks or rooms. The cold reasserts itself, and the fires must be fed again, burning through the woodpile at a rate that would horrify a peasant family. Afternoon brings various occupations. Lord Robert might train with weapons. Even in winter, a nobleman must maintain military readiness. He practices sword work in the hall, footwork and form, building the muscle memory that might save his life if war comes. Or he might hunt, if weather permits. Winter hunting is difficult, but not impossible. Deer driven to desperation by hunger become easier to approach, and dogs can track through snow. Fresh venison is welcome variety in the winter diet. These hunts are social occasions as much as practical ones. Lord Robert might invite neighbouring nobles, using the hunt as an opportunity to maintain relationships, exchange news, arrange marriages between their children. For the nobility, winter is a time for social consolidation. Summer means travel, military campaigns, attending the king's court. Winter means staying close to home, but that doesn't mean isolation. Other nobles visit, despite difficult travel. They come with their retinues, their servants, their demands for hospitality. Lord Robert must feed them, house them, entertain them. All of this from the same stores that must feed his own household until spring. These visits are expensive and obligatory. To refuse hospitality is to insult the guest, to violate the social codes that hold the noble class together. So Lord Robert welcomes visitors even when their presence strains his resources. Evening brings the household together again for supper, a lighter meal than dinner, but still formal, still structured by hierarchy. Then comes the time for entertainment, for the activities that make long winter nights bearable. Music is important. Lord Robert employs a minstrel, not a famous performer, just a competent musician who can sing, play the lute, entertain the household through dark evenings. The minstrel sings of courtly love, of chivalric deeds, of heroes and battles and romantic tragedy. Sometimes there are games, chess for Lord Robert and his peers, simpler games of dice or tables for others. Gambling is common, money changing hands in wagers that would shock the peasants who pay those coins in rent. Sometimes there's storytelling. Someone recounts a tale from romance or legend, Charlemagne's paladins, Arthur's knights, saints' lives, stories of pilgrimage and miracle. These stories are participatory, the audience commenting, questioning, sometimes disputing details. As night deepens, the household gradually retires. Servants bed down in the hall itself, wrapped in blankets, sleeping near the central fire. Others sleep in corridors, in small rooms, in the kitchen near its large hearth. Lord Robert and Lady Eleanor retire to their chamber. The warming pan has been prepared, the bed slightly warmed. They climb in and pull the curtains closed, creating a small enclosed space that holds their body heat. Even in this privileged sleeping arrangement, cold penetrates. The chamber is draughty. The fire in their small hearth dies down during the night. By morning, they'll wake to cold air and the need to begin the cycle again. What differentiates their winter from Agnes's winter? Material comfort, certainly. More food, better clothing, warmer shelter. But the difference is one of degree, not kind. They're still cold, still confined indoors, still waiting for spring, still at the mercy of stores that might or might not suffice. Lord Robert worries as Agnes worries. His worries are different. Political alliances, obligations to greater lords, maintaining his status. But they're worries nonetheless, keeping him awake some nights, pressing on him with the same weight that hunger presses on Agnes. His privilege is real but limited. He can be warmer than Agnes, but not warm. He can eat better than Agnes, but he still faces scarcity. He has power over her life, but he himself is constrained by those above him and by the same winter that threatens everyone. The social distance between hall and village is vast. Lord Robert rarely thinks of Agnes as an individual. She's one of many tenants, interchangeable, significant only as a source of labour and rent. If asked about her specifically, he might not even know her name. Yet their fates are linked. If Agnes and her neighbours starve, the estate fails. If Lord Robert mismanages his obligations, if he's stripped of his lands, Agnes and her neighbours face new, possibly worse, lordship. The medieval social order is organic, interdependent. Each level needs the others, however much they might resent or misunderstand each other. Lord Robert's warm hall is built on peasant labour. Agnes's survival depends on Lord Robert's administration. Winter reveals these dependencies. In summer, the illusion of independence is easier to maintain. Peasants work their fields, nobles travel. The layers of society interact minimally. In winter, everyone is pressed close together, noble and peasant alike, confined by cold to small spaces, all waiting for the same spring thaw. The noble winter is gentler but not gentle. The stones of the manor hall are the same stones quarried from the same earth that yields Agnes's clay pots. The cold that seeps through is the same cold. The fear of illness, of death, of stores running low. These fears are shared across the social divide. If you could observe both Agnes's cottage and Lord Robert's hall on a winter evening, you would see parallels. Both have fires burning. Both have people huddled close for warmth. Both have someone lying awake worrying about the future. The quality of light is different. Agnes has no candles, Lord Robert has many. The quality of food is different. Agnes's thin soup, Lord Robert's roasted meat. The quality of shelter is different. Packed earth versus stone flags, thatch versus tile. But the fundamental experience is similar: endurance, waiting, the slow passage of winter days, the hope that spring will arrive before disaster strikes. Lord Robert has more margin for error. His stores are larger, his house sturdier, his clothing warmer. If winter lasts longer than expected, he'll survive where Agnes might not. That's what privilege means in practical terms, a buffer against catastrophe. Yet catastrophe remains possible even for him. A particularly harsh winter could deplete even manor stores. Disease respects no social rank. Plague and fever kill nobles as readily as peasants. Political misfortune could strip him of everything overnight. He knows this. His confidence is partial, hedged with awareness of fragility. The manor's thick walls are real protection, but they're not invincible. Winter gets in, illness gets in, political danger gets in. The hall is warmer than the cottage, but it's not safe. As February arrives, the worst month, the month when stores are lowest and spirits flag, both hall and cottage enter the most dangerous period. This is when winter wins or loses, when survival is decided, when the weakest fall and the strong barely hold on. Lord Robert watches his grain stores dwindle. He recalculates constantly, as Agnes does, arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. It will be close. They'll make it, probably, but there's no comfortable margin. He makes decisions that affect Agnes's family directly. He demands rents be paid, labour service performed, because his own obligations continue regardless of hardship. He's not heartless in this. He's trapped in the same system, answering to the same relentless logic of survival. Sometimes he shows mercy. A tenant whose child has died might have rent forgiven. A widow might receive extra grain from manor stores. These gestures are part Christian charity, part practical calculation. Keeping tenants alive ensures next year's labour. But mercy has limits. Too much leniency and the estate fails. Too little and tenants flee or starve, leaving the land unworked. Lord Robert walks this line carefully, trying to balance competing demands with imperfect information and limited resources. In both cottage and hall, winter wears on. The days remain short. The cold remains pervasive. The waiting continues. Spring is coming, it always comes, but it's not here yet, and not yet is a gulf that must be crossed with depleting strength and stores. Lord Robert stands at his hall window one grey afternoon, looking down toward the village where smoke rises from cottage chimneys. He sees the landscape in terms of property, of rents, of obligations owed and due. He doesn't think about Agnes specifically, but he thinks about the tenants, collectively, as a problem to be managed. Agnes, at the same moment, might glance up toward the manor, seeing smoke rise from multiple chimneys, and feel what? Resentment? Acceptance? Both. The distance between cottage and hall is measured in more than feet. It's a gulf of experience, of opportunity, of the different ways winter touches different lives. Yet both are cold, both are waiting, both are hoping to survive until spring breaks winter's grip and life can begin again. In that shared hope, in that shared vulnerability to winter's power, noble and peasant are briefly, uncomfortably equal. We've walked through a winter now, felt its cold through Agnes's thin shoes and through Lord Robert's fur-lined boots, tasted its hunger in thin porridge and rationed feasts, endured its darkness in smoky cottages and draughty halls. The journey has been long, as winter itself was long for those who lived it. What have we learned that's been forgotten? Perhaps most fundamentally this. Winter was not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be endured, a force that shaped life in ways so profound that modern comfort has erased them from our understanding. Medieval peasants didn't fight winter, they accommodated it, worked with it, developed intricate knowledge of its moods and rhythms. They knew things we've lost. How to read the night by sound and silence. How to bank a fire so it lives until morning. How to judge by the quality of cold whether snow would come or frost would bite deepest. They understood that survival required community, that no family could make it through alone. The networks of mutual aid that sustained villages through winter, shared labor, borrowed tools, gifts of food when one family faced crisis. These were sophisticated social technologies we've replaced with institutions and markets. They knew hunger intimately, not as temporary discomfort, but as constant companion. They learned to function with less food than we would consider adequate, to work despite weakness, to make decisions about who ate and how much with a clarity born of desperate necessity. They possessed patience we can barely imagine, the patience to sit for hours spinning thread by dim firelight, to wait months for snow to melt, to endure confinement without entertainment or distraction, filling time with small, repetitive tasks that kept hands busy and minds from despair. Their relationship with darkness was different from ours. They knew true darkness, unrelieved by streetlights or screens, and they learned to navigate it, to rest in it, to find in winter's long nights a kind of peace we chase with sleeping pills and meditation apps. They understood cold as a presence, almost a personality, knowing its variations, its behaviors, the ways it moved through spaces and settled into bodies. They learned to negotiate with it rather than simply banishing it, accepting some cold as inevitable while fighting fiercely to maintain pockets of warmth where life could persist. Their knowledge of materials, of wood and wool and stone, was deep and tactile. They could judge firewood by weight and smell, knew which woods burned hot and which burned long, understood how moisture affected burning and how to season wood for optimal heat. They knew textiles with a precision we've lost, which weaves trapped warmth best, how to layer different fabrics for maximum insulation, how to repair and repurpose every scrap of cloth because new fabric was precious beyond our comprehension. They understood food preservation in ways that combined chemistry and tradition, fermentation, drying, salting, storing, techniques that kept food edible through months without refrigeration, without the chemical preservatives we take for granted. Their winter wisdom was hard-earned, built on generations of trial and error, passed down through demonstration and story. It was knowledge written not in books but in practice, in the movements of hands, in the rhythm of daily tasks repeated until they became instinct. And much of this knowledge has vanished. We don't need it anymore. Central heating replaces the art of firekeeping. Supermarkets replace food preservation skills. Electric lights banish darkness. Modern medicine treats the illnesses that winter once made deadly. This is progress, undeniably. Few of us would choose to live as Agnes lived, cold and hungry and uncertain. The comfort we enjoy is real comfort, earned through centuries of technological advancement and social change. But something has been lost in the gaining. We've lost the intimate knowledge of seasons, the deep attention to natural rhythms, the understanding that humans are part of larger cycles beyond our control. We've lost the skills that made survival possible in harsh conditions, skills that might matter again if our comfortable systems fail. We've lost the communal bonds that winter hardship forged, replacing them with individualism and isolation. We've lost, perhaps most significantly, the humility that comes from understanding human smallness in the face of winter's power. Medieval peasants knew themselves as fragile, temporary, vulnerable, and this knowledge shaped how they lived, how they treated each other, how they understood their place in the world. Tonight, as you rest in your warm bed with darkness held at bay by a simple switch, with food abundant in your refrigerator and heat available at the touch of a button, take a moment to remember Agnes. Remember her cold feet on frozen floors, her careful rationing of grain, her worry over her children's survival. Remember Lord Robert, too, in his draughty hall, warm by medieval standards, but still cold by ours, burdened by responsibilities he couldn't escape, waiting like everyone else for spring's arrival. Remember the mysteries we can't quite solve, the worn hearthstones, the foundation deposits, the winter rituals whose meanings have dissolved into time. Remember that past people were not like us, that they inhabited a world of meaning and experience we can barely glimpse. Remember that winter once meant something different, not an inconvenience, but a season of testing, not 3 months marked on a calendar, but a living presence that demanded respect, attention, and hard-won wisdom to survive. And as you drift towards sleep, warm and safe and comfortable, let yourself feel gratitude, not just for modern convenience, but for all those generations who survived winters without it, who passed their knowledge down through centuries, who endured so that you could eventually enjoy the ease you know tonight. Their struggles are over now. Agnes and Thomas, William and Margaret, Lord Robert and Lady Eleanor, all of them are centuries gone, their bones long since returned to the earth they worked and walked. The cottages have crumbled, the manor fallen to ruin, the specific winters they endured merged into the general past. But their experience remains embedded in the landscape, preserved in archaeological traces, echoing faintly in folk practices that survive without explanation. And in remembering them, in imagining their lives, in trying to understand what they knew and how they survived, we retrieve something valuable, a perspective on human endurance, on adaptation, on the many ways people have learned to live in difficult circumstances. Winter always ends. That was the certainty that sustained medieval people through the darkest, coldest months. However long it lasted, however severe it became, winter would eventually break. Spring would return. The cycle would continue. They had seen it happen every year of their lives. They trusted in its return the way they trusted sunrise would follow night. This trust wasn't blind faith. It was grounded in observation, in experience, in the reliable patterns of the natural world. And so they endured. Day after day, week after week, month after cold month, they performed their small tasks, maintained their fires, rationed their stores, cared for their children, and waited. Not with drama or heroism, but with quiet persistence, with the knowledge that survival is often just a matter of holding on through one more day, and then another, and then another. Until finally, though we haven't seen it in our journey tonight, the day would come when the cold loosened its grip slightly, when the sun felt warmer on the face, when the first shoots of green appeared in sheltered spots, when birds returned and the ice began to melt and winter's hold, so absolute for so long, began finally to break. That day is coming for Agnes, for Thomas, for all of them. Not yet, not in the depths of the winter we've walked through, but coming nonetheless. Inevitable as the seasons themselves. And with spring will come relief, renewal, the joy of having survived another winter. The stores will be nearly empty, the people thin and weak, but alive. The livestock will be gaunt, but still standing. The seeds saved through winter will go into warming earth, beginning the cycle again. Life will expand outward from winter's constriction. The long days will return, the hunger will ease, the cold will retreat. And for a few precious months, survival will seem less precarious, less uncertain, less like a daily battle. Then autumn will come, and with it the knowledge that winter follows. And the cycle of preparation will begin again, gathering, storing, preserving, bracing for the cold that is always coming, always inevitable, always demanding the same patient endurance. This was the rhythm of medieval life, not progress towards something better, but cycles, eternal return, the same seasons bringing the same challenges, met with the same hard-won wisdom, year after year, generation after generation. We've broken that cycle now. Our winters are climatically controlled, our food supply divorced from seasons. We've escaped the tyranny of natural rhythms, and this escape is among humanity's greatest achievements. But in our remembering, in our imagining of lives lived in deeper connection to those rhythms, we might find something worth preserving. A sense of proportion, an awareness of vulnerability, a respect for the forces that shape existence, whether we acknowledge them or not. Let Agnes be your guide into sleep tonight. Let her cold fingers and careful fire-tending and patient endurance accompany you into rest. Let her knowledge, so different from yours, remind you that there are many ways to be human, many types of wisdom, many kinds of strength. The winter she survived is over, but its lessons remain quiet and persistent as falling snow, waiting for those who would listen. And in the listening, in the remembering, in the attempt to understand what has been forgotten, we honor those who came before and learn something, perhaps, about ourselves. Sleep now. Let the warmth enfold you. Let the darkness be gentle. And let your dreams carry you through centuries, backward to a time when winter meant something we've forgotten, when cold was intimate and hunger familiar, when survival itself was the highest achievement and spring the greatest blessing. The fires are banked, the stores are counted, the night stretches long and deep. And somewhere in that darkness Agnes sleeps too, her children pressed against her, her breath visible in the frigid air, her dreams perhaps touching yours across the gulf of time. Rest well. Spring is coming, it always does. And until it arrives, we endure as they endured, as humans have always endured, with patience, with persistence, with the quiet knowledge that this too shall pass, that winter's grip will loosen, that light and warmth will return in their season. Good night. May your sleep be peaceful, your dreams gentle, your rest complete. And when you wake tomorrow to your comfortable modern morning, remember for just a moment the countless cold dawns that came before, the fires coaxed back to life, the daily miracle of survival in a time when winter was not conquered but coexisted with, respected, and ultimately always survived.